Hi, this is Andrew, and this is Keen On, the daily chat show featuring the world's leading thinkers and writers. Hello, everybody. Given what's happening in the Middle East and Israel and Gaza and more broadly, we're going to return to history today to talk about one of the founders, perhaps the most influential founder of the State of Israel, Chaim Weizmann, the first president of the country, and enormously influential in terms of the Zionist movement. There's a new book out about him, Chaim Weizmann, a biography written by Jehuda Reinharz and Moti Galani. And we have the great Jehuda Reinharz on the show. He's a very distinguished historian. He's talking to us from Israel. He spends most of his life in the Boston area. He's formerly president of Brandeis University, one of the world's leading historians. He's joining us, as I said, from Jerusalem in Israel. Yehuda, congratulations on the new book. It's just out.
Thank you very much.
So, for people who don't know this Chaim Weizmann, Yehuda, tell me about him. Tell me why he's such a big deal.
Well, to be truthful, for a long time, Chaim Weizmann was not really very well known. If you read Zionist historiography or Jewish history, he is mentioned, but he's mentioned sort of in passing. So that between Theodor Herzl, who founded the Jewish Congress, and Ben-Gurion, it's as if he played no role. Whereas, in fact, I and my co-author, we contend that without Weizmann, there would be no Jewish state today, or at least not a Jewish state in 1948.
It's interesting. I was doing a little bit of research on you back in 2015. Some of your colleagues brought out an anthology, The Individual in History, Essays in Honor of Jehuda Reinharz. Does that reflect the fact, Yehuda, that you think individuals rather than social, economic, political, cultural forces determine history?
No, it's not one or the other, but individuals can play a major role. And in fact, in the case of Weizmann, I would say that it's probably one of the few instances in history where a person who is bereft of any land, who is not appointed by anyone as president, who has no kingdom or territory, is able to move Great Britain, the largest empire in the world, overseeing something like 48 countries, 6 times the size of the Roman Empire. And here's this guy who is a lecturer in Manchester. He comes to London at the beginning of World War I and persuades the British to finally in 1917 to send this letter. It's a letter. It's not a declaration. He makes it a declaration. Send a letter that says, well, the Jews are entitled to perhaps a land of their own in Palestine. He doesn't say of Palestine, in Palestine. And the idea is that they need to get along with their neighbors and all the rest. So I think that individuals like Chaim Weizmann can make a huge difference, but it does not negate any other kinds of forces that play a role as well.
And we'll, of course, get to the Balfour Declaration, his role and the significance of that later in this conversation. You said that, in a sense, he moved mountains. There's a biblical metaphor there. Is there a biblical quality to his biography, the story of his life?
Well, you know, you can say at the end, it's really a good observation, because at the end of his life, he seems like the biblical Moses. He can see the land. Moses couldn't get into the land, Weizmann did, but he's really no longer effective. In 1949, he becomes the president, but he's really just a figure. He's not a figurehead. He's not really he's not the kind of a president that he thought he would be, like Truman and others. So he's essentially at the end of his life, and really hanging in there. It's actually a very sad last 3 years of his life.
Yeah, you mentioned Moses, Yehuda. Some people might interpret from that that this whole narrative is a kind of warning. Some people read the narrative in the Old Testament as a warning about a people being slightly overambitious, rather hubristic. Is there a hubristic quality to Weizmann, both in his life and perhaps in what he accomplished?
Well, I don't know if I would call it hubristic, because Weizmann was also a person who was always questioning himself. He appeared as being very decisive, as somebody who knows exactly what he wants. He could actually frighten British prime ministers and members of parliament. But essentially, he was always doubting himself. Not quite like Moses. Moses was much more decisive than Weizmann. And I'm not sure that this comparison is a good one. But Weizmann, in fact, was a man of many contradictions. He couldn't really give a great lecture, but he was a wonderful conversationalist. He was able to, in order to, since you mentioned the Balfour Declaration, in order to get the Balfour Declaration, it has been counted by some of his friends that he had some 2,000 personal interviews in order to get there. Whether that's true or not, I don't know.
What do you mean personal interviews? You mean conversations?
Conversations, yes. Conversations with, he was able, because of his invention, he was able to hobnob with British high society, with members of parliament, with the prime minister, in fact. And this is what I mean by these kinds of conversations, one-on-one.
So what was he like? In the Wikipedia entry, a long entry, Israel Seif described him as a man of the people, of the masses, not an elitist, a folk mensch. Did he have the common touch? He clearly was a master schmoozer, to use a Yiddish term.
Yes, he was. He was a man of the people. He came from very humble beginnings. But it's more complicated. Early on in his life, I would say until his 40s, Weizmann was, in fact, considered himself man of the people. He had no ambitions to high office. He was ambitious, okay, in terms of his work, in terms of friendships, etc. But he became a man who, first of all, because of his Yiddish and Hebrew, and facility with other languages as well. He also knew French, obviously English, but he never denied his belonging to the common people, even when he rose to great prominence.
How aware consciously was he of this great division amongst European Jews between, shall we say, the left, socialism, internationalism, communism, and Zionism? I think he had many brothers and sisters, some of which were on the left. He was born in pre-revolutionary Russia, and then, of course, when it became the Soviet Union, some of his siblings stayed and rose up, became fairly prominent. Some were killed by Stalin. Right. Was he aware, in terms of these forces of history, that there was this fundamental intellectual discord between Zionism and socialism?
Absolutely. This awakening into political discourse came when he left his homeland and moved to first Germany and then Switzerland. And in Switzerland, many Eastern European Jews congregated because both men and women were accepted into the universities in Switzerland. And that was a very fertile ground for people of the Bund, people of other socialist organizations, and the Zionists to debate each other, which they did every night in the coffee houses. That's where Weizmann really got his first really strong political inclinations, his understanding of the kinds of forces that could be, in fact, be harnessed to the Zionist movement. And, he started his career in the Zionist movement as a member of the opposition of Theodor Herzl, who was the founder of the group. And so he began to understand how to organize, how to bring people along to his point of view. And, these guys had debates every night, sometimes talks, speeches went 3 hours, 4 hours. Anything that was less than that didn't seem to be a serious speech. And he was part of it. It was a very exciting period for him.
Very exciting for anyone. It reminds me of Solzhenitsyn's book on Lenin in Zurich, when Solzhenitsyn writes about Lenin. I'm not sure if it was only Solzhenitsyn, that Lenin was so focused on the revolution that he even gave up playing chess. And I'm not sure in the late 19th, early 20th centuries whether the dream of an Israeli Zionist state versus a Soviet state, one was more or less realistic. Was Weizmann, did he have that Leninist quality of intellectual rigor and discipline? Or was he more of a friendly guy who sort of fell into his historical role? Lenin always seems to have known that he was made to make history.
First of all, they looked alike.
Oh, they did? Maybe they were the same guys. Is that a possibility, Yehuda?
No, but there is some evidence that the two of them met in Zurich. And but I don't have enough evidence to prove this.
Well, someone needs to do some of your. I've had a number of Israeli novelists on the show. That would make a wonderful fictional story. But anyway, go on.
Well, look, as I said, he received his political education in the West, and became a leader of an organization called the Zionist Fraction, which opposed Theodor Herzl. Opposed the idea of Uganda, which is where Herzl and some of the Russians and Western Europeans thought that they could establish a homeland, and he began to really think in big terms. So that already by the early 20th century, 1904, 1905, etc., he and Martin Buber and others began to think of what's going to happen in Palestine one day. And even thought of creating a Hebrew university. And Weizmann actually is the original founder of the Hebrew University in Jerusalem, which came about right after World War I. And began publishing all kinds of tracts, et cetera, until he moved to Manchester in 1904. He realized he could not get a decent job in Switzerland. And so he moved to Manchester in 1904, received a low position at the university, and slowly rose in the ranks of the faculty to become eventually a reader, which was a tenured position. And that's really where
he was in chemistry. He was a scientist. He must have been rather miserable, though, moving to Manchester. It rains there all the time, doesn't it, Yehuda?
Actually, he was miserable. You're absolutely right. First of all, he worked in a lousy job, in a lousy lab, I should say, and he always was short of money. He never had enough money to do the kinds of things he wanted. For example, to travel on behalf of the Zionist organization, and eventually his wife joined him in Manchester. He felt somewhat better. But
he liked the women, didn't he? There's some stories when he was younger. He had various liaisons with one woman or another. He ended up with the wife, but he clearly was a man who was attracted to women, and women found attractive.
Not only when he was younger, also when he got older. He was attracted to women, and by the way, he was also attracted to men, not in a physical sense. To women, yes. We don't really know what actually happened. I don't have any evidence for that. But by my count, he had at least 8 women with whom he had some kind of a deep relationship. And in one case, he almost married one of them. and then thought the better of it because he thought that would affect his position in the Zionist organization.
Well, he must have been attractive. There's the Martin Luther King element there, of course, where Martin Luther King was also very popular with his followers. So at what point in Manchester, in this rather sad sojourn in Manchester, Yehuda, did Chaim Weizmann go from being a junior faculty member in northwestern England, rainy Manchester, to becoming an associate of Balfour and the rest of the British aristocracy?
I will just say one more thing because it relates also to his later life. He did make some friends, some influential friends in Manchester, the Zeef family and other families, and, which became very important to him later on in life. In 1914...
And just sorry to jump in, there was, of course, a fairly significant Jewish community in Manchester, which I assumed he became integrated into.
Yes, the fact that he spoke obviously fluent Yiddish, this was his mother tongue, came in very handy because he spoke to the masses, and they didn't meet a person like this before. And so that was the beginning of really his role as a spokesperson for Zionism. Eventually, he rose in the ranks of the Zionist organization in England, became a vice president, which didn't really mean much. And but what brought him to London really was his friendship with a very well-known editor in Manchester, who paved the way for him to meet Lloyd George. Now, Weizmann thought always, and it's clear in his letters, that if somebody would only pay his tickets to go to London and come back, he could convince the greatest power in the world to find a way to establish a Jewish state or some Jewish entity in Palestine. But what made the difference is that he invented something that no other chemist in England invented, although they tried to find somebody, namely synthetic acetone. And acetone was very important during World War I because if mixed with cordite, it makes the shooting of guns or cannons or whatever smokeless, which was very important so that the enemy could not detect these guns. And no other chemist could come up with this invention. So he became, first of all, he was appointed a member of the Admiralty. He had some high position. He was in charge of a number of factories which were converted to produce this synthetic acetone. And by virtue of that position, he got to meet then, and he moved obviously to London out of Manchester.
Yeah.
And by virtue of that, he began to meet high society in Great Britain. I have to just add one more thing here, which is important. As you mentioned before, and as we discussed, he did come from humble family, and the West was a new world for him. But in the process, he became more and more. He became a citizen in 1910, and he saw himself as British, not as somebody who liked the British, not somebody who, but as a British. He began to dress like a British citizen. He eventually became very wealthy after World War I because a byproduct of acetone after the war became very important in the production of lacquer and was important in the production of cars. And so he commissioned a couple of factories in the United States and became, as I said, very wealthy. Lived in a big house in London.
He became an aristocrat, like everyone ends up in England. So, Yehuda, we got to take a break in a second because after and then we'll get on to the Israel chapter, more controversial, I guess, in this narrative. But before we get there, he lived during the First World War, the most violent war still perhaps in history. He was a chemist who got rich by inventing a synthetic technology for warfare. He was a man from Russia, must have experienced some degree of anti-Semitic violence. What was his attitude? And of course, we all know the tragically violent history, not only of the 20th century Jewish people, but of the situation in the Middle East. What was his experience and attitude to violence?
Well, he actually did not experience himself that much violence when he grew up in a little townlet called Motel, where the town that was divided between Jews and non-Jews. For the most part, they got along.
So no pogroms?
No, not in that town, not during his lifetime. His father, in fact, was elected a member of some kind of a council in that town, which was unusual for a Jew. And I would say that in terms of conditions of the time, they did okay. They had a pretty large house with a garden. He had many, as you mentioned before, brothers and sisters. Relatively speaking, they were doing okay. But so he didn't experience any of that during that time. Of course, he knew that anti-Semitism was around. And of course, he did what every Jewish boy tried to do, escaped the army of the Tsar and fled Russia, and that's how he went to Germany, and from there to Switzerland. So it was, but since you mentioned Eastern Europe, he had a disdain for Eastern European Jews. He had a disdain for two kinds of people. He had disdain for people Jews who became wealthy and pretended not to know anymore that they have a Jewish heritage, or pretended not to be Jews. And he had disdain for those what he called Luftmenschen, people who lived from the air, as it is, and did not work a productive life. And add to all of that is his British new appearance. By the way, he dressed like a Brit. He was 6 foot tall. You can see him here. He was 6 foot tall.
Yeah, he had the tie and the shirt and everything.
He dressed well, and he bought his shirts and his underwear and everything else in the best stores that you can imagine.
Did he get teased by other Jews for his upper class aspirations?
No, he was envied, if anything. He was envied.
Did he have much of a sense of humor? Were people able to make fun of him, or did he take himself a bit seriously?
Not only did he have a good sense of humor, but one of the reasons I think that the British high society accepted him. He dined and moved in everybody's home, and when he became wealthy, he invited everybody to his house. He had a chauffeur, he had a couple of maids, maybe more than a couple of maids, and he behaved like a member of high society.
Was he a kind of court Jew in the sense that the British upper class, culturally, socially, politically, found a man who aspired to them, and they embraced him because he wanted to be like them?
No, I think he fascinated them. That goes back to your question about jokes. Weizmann was in the habit of telling Jewish jokes to the Brits, and they had never met a Jew like this, who tells jokes about Jews, and by the way, with a very heavy accent, which he never tried to change. He was a Jew, but he was also he considered himself not pro-British. He was British. And I think that's very important to understand, because that's really how they also saw him. They, of course, knew who he was. They knew where he came from, but they respected him. And by the way, we can go into this too. He was feared by many of the people in government. He knew everybody. And one of the things he could do, which no one else could do, he could walk into the prime minister's office. He could he could walk in literally without an appointment to the office of the minister for the colonies, who was Churchill at the time. And nobody thought that this was something unusual.
He reminds me of my friend Yossi Vardi. Do you know him?
Yes, I know who he is. I met him once. Yeah.
I'll have to tell Yossi that he's a little like Chaim Weizmann. We got to take a break now, Yehuda, because I want to thank our friends. Really a remarkable conversation about Chaim Weizmann. We got to thank our friends at Liberties, which is edited by wonderful people. They are supporting this show and great guests like Jehuda Reinharz. We're going to take a short break, show a little video of Liberties, and then we'll be back to talk about the more controversial part of Weizmann's life, which is Zionism, how he imagined the state of Israel, and what he accomplished in the second half of his life. So for this second half of the conversation, we'll be back in a second.
Okay.
The noise, there is nuance, insight. Liberties is not just a journal of ideas. It's a meteor of intelligent substance. It's the place to be for engaged citizens. Politics, opinion, substance. Liberties is a triumph for freedom of thought. A quarterly of urgency, of cultural exploration, of intellectual delight, of immaculate prose. It's invaluable. Subscribe now or find Liberties at your favorite bookseller.
And you can subscribe to Liberties at libertiesjournal.com. We are speaking with Jehuda Reinharz, the co-author of a major new biography, perhaps the definitive biography of Chaim Weizmann, the first president of Israel, and perhaps the most influential, with Theodor Herzl, Zionist in history. First half of the conversation, Yehuda, we talked about this Russian exile, chemist who ended up in Manchester, schmoozer, charming man, aspired to become a British aristocrat, told Jewish jokes. He had a dream, this dream of a state of Israel that would be carved out of the British Empire. But it was an absurd dream. No, as I suggested at the beginning of our conversation, no more or less absurd a dream than Lenin's idea of taking over the old Russian Empire. But of course, they both achieved what they wanted, for better or worse. Tell us a little bit more about how concrete his vision was of a Jewish, quote unquote, homeland in the British province of Palestine.
It's a long story, but I'll try to shorten it. One thing that I bet you most people don't know is that Weizmann, beginning in 1918, he was not yet the president of the World Zionist Organization. He simply was the guy who got this letter, which he made into a declaration, the Balfour Declaration. So the Jewish people all over the world were absolutely thrilled. But here's what most people don't know. Weizmann, from the very first, believed that there ought to be an Arab state, a Palestinian state, in this territory called Palestine, next to a Jewish entity. And I'll give you some examples. In 1918, one of the first things he did was travel to see the Sharif of the Sharif of Mecca,
Faisal, right?
Faisal, and proposed to him that he establish an Arab state in this territory. In fact, they signed a contract together that said that there would be a Jewish and an Arab entity next to each other, and signed, I believe, in January of 1990.
So he didn't he didn't peddle the idea of Israel being a state without people for a people without a state, or a people without land. He acknowledged that there were a large community of non-Jewish Arab people already there.
He more than acknowledged. He tried to persuade them that they needed to move on creating an Arab state. He met with the Husseinis, the Nashashibis, the mayor of Jerusalem, the Mufti of Jerusalem, and everybody he could lay his hands on. And by the way, also with Arabs in Egypt, in Lebanon, in Syria, trying to persuade them that they needed to create their own entity. He saw in his vision, he saw an Arab state as a natural entity next to a Zionist entity. And by the way, what people don't know is that beginning in 1931, he advocated with the British for a Palestinian state in this territory. And over and over and over again. And in fact, he is the one who proposed, after the Peel Commission went to Palestine, that the land be divided, and actually a map was created.
Right, I want to get to that, but before we get there, this is a complicated story, and we have a lot to cover still, Jehuda. Okay. Tell us about the Balfour Declaration. Here was a man who successfully got into the Prime Minister's office and convinced a British Prime Minister, British Foreign Secretary, of the need to establish a Jewish state in the Middle East. What happened? How did he achieve this, and what was the outcome?
Look, the British needed the Zionists as much as the Zionists needed the British. On the one hand, you're talking about Great Britain, 58 countries that whatever the number is, 3/4 or a third of whatever it is, huge number of countries and territory that they controlled. The British wanted to also, first of all, many people in high society in Britain had a sentiment toward the Holy Land. The Holy Land was something very important to them. It was important for them to control it. Now, you know that there was the Sykes-Picot Agreement in the middle of the war.
And he knew Mark Sykes, of course.
Yes, he knew Mark Sykes, and of course there was a division between Syria, Lebanon, and Palestine. The British wanted Palestine, and which suited Weizmann very well. The Balfour letter that Lord Balfour and the cabinet, it was not just Lord Balfour, Lord Balfour signed it, was just one of dozens of letters of this sort that were given to Armenians, to the Arabs, to anybody who was moving, in order to attract them to support, whether it was Germany, it was France, etc., etc.
And much of this was the old classic old perfidious Albion, lots of empty promises.
That's correct. But look, and I'm going to say it outright, the Armenians, the Arabs, the Kurds, all of the others who got these kinds of letters, almost exactly the same kinds of letters, did not have a Weizmann. And Weizmann's ability to play a role in British society and in Parliament and with the Prime Minister, Lloyd George, who was very favorably disposed, that made the difference. And so they wrote this letter. What does this letter say? His Majesty's government view with favor the establishment in Palestine, not of Palestine, of et cetera, et cetera. It being clearly understood that nothing should be done to harm any of the other citizens in that country. It was perfect for Weizmann. And he made it a declaration. He made the British believe for 30 years that what they wrote in that letter was a declaration of support, which eventually became ratified in San Remo and became an international document. It was not just British. So that was Weizmann's genius, is to, and his sentiment toward Arabs, who, by the way, didn't know what to do with him, and eventually became hostile to him. But behind the scenes, as I'm getting back to that, he tried to persuade the British, who held the mandate for Palestine, that they needed to have their own state. And in 1937, the Peel Plan, and later on UNSCOP, United Nations Special Commission on Palestine, ratified it. And he persuaded Ben-Gurion, who was much more militant than he, that the Jews ought to accept the UN resolution of creating a state eventually. So none of the Arab leaders took the opportunity to establish. Weizmann said in 1937 that he would accept a land, the part of the land, as, and this was his exaggerated expression, as large as a handkerchief. Why? He said, I have to save the Jews of Europe who are being killed, or not yet killed, but harassed.
Well, but in 1919, the situation was different. Some people might push back, Yehuda, and say, well, this was Arab land. There may have been some Jews there. They had this pipe dream of an Israeli, Jewish, Hebrew state from a certain reading of the Bible. Why should the Arabs give up anything? Why should they allow
First
the
of all,
Jews to have any kind of state in a land that they hadn't been for many centuries?
First of all, who said this was Arab land? The Ottoman Empire controlled this entire. This, if anything, this was Ottoman lands. The Ottomans controlled for 400 years that entire territory, including Syria, Lebanon, and all the rest, and were defeated by the British at the end of the war. So it was not Arab land. It was not Jewish land. There was Jewish land, the land that Jews bought. There was land that Arabs bought as well. And Jews, when they wanted land, if they had the funds, bought it from Arabs. They didn't just take it. They didn't just conquer it. I think that that's really a very well known and very well documented history of that period.
So Weizmann becomes the symbol of Zionism as you have the rise to power of the Nazis and other anti-Semitic, violent anti-Semitic movements in Europe in the 30s. There seems to be a split within Zionism of a leftist socialist Zionism, and then the Zionism of Jabotinsky, and an embrace of, if not of violence, of certainly violence resistance against anti-Semitism. Was Weizmann involved in these conversations, or was he always the avuncular figure above it all?
You know, I want to tell you, if we have 2 minutes, Weizmann was a supporter from 1920 on of something called the Haganah. The Haganah was the Jewish, if you want, defense force.
The resistance.
Resistance in Palestine. In 1921, he had a meeting for reasons that we don't have time to get into, with Lloyd George, with Balfour, with Churchill, et cetera, and in which he really chastised Churchill in front of his boss, Lloyd George, because he thought that Herbert Samuel, who was the governor of Palestine at the time, the High Commissioner for Palestine, was trying to give some of the land to the Bedouins in Jordan, or what became Jordan. And he chastised Churchill, which is something that you don't do you do it in Israel, but you don't do this in England. So, and Churchill said to him, you know, I know that you are shipping guns to Palestine. He says, I know, you know that this is forbidden, but I'll tell you what, you can do it, just don't tell anybody. Which
was a very Churchillian.
So he was involved from the beginning, and he supported defense. Now, he did not support violence. Weizmann's mantra throughout the period until the very end was, we do not want to rule, but we also don't want to be ruled. That was his mantra. And he stood fast by that mantra. And he did not approve of violence against anybody except in self-defense. When it came to self-defense, he says, we will use everything we can in order to defend ourselves. But we are not going to wantonly kill or try to chase Arabs or anybody else off their land.
What was did he have relations with Jabotinsky?
Yes. In fact, during World War I, Jabotinsky lived with Weizmann in his bachelor apartment.
Oh,
and some people say, again, this is gossip, but I might as well give you some gossip.
No, I like gossip.
Right. So they say that his bad relations with Jabotinsky were because he suspected that Jabotinsky and Vera Weizmann, Weizmann's wife, had something going on. Now, I don't think so, but there was a warm relationship between the two. That's for sure. I mean, that I know.
Yeah, Jabotinsky was a rather dashing character, wasn't he?
Correct. Yeah, and I mean, just like Weizmann. I mean,
these were alpha Jews. Is that one way of putting it?
Yeah, I guess so. Weizmann was
he achieved a great deal. I mean, a remarkable man, remarkable life. But the one thing he seemed to have failed at was saving European Jewry. He got into the offices of British prime ministers, American presidents, but he failed really in getting the Western powers in the late 30s and during the Second World War to concretely address the mass murder of European Jews. Is that fair?
I think it's fair. I think he did try to say, he became, by the way, in 1931, he was ousted from the leadership of the Zionist organization. And he used that time to create an organization to try to save German Jews. He also tried to bring many German Jews to Palestine at the time, to the Ziv Institute, which is the precursor of the Weizmann Institute. And he was not successful in most cases in bringing the big scientists from Germany, people like Willstätter, Einstein, etc.
Einstein, he was friendly with Einstein, wasn't he?
Friendly up to a point. They both strong personalities who in the mid 1930s were always fighting on about.
Although Einstein was in another league when it came to scientific achievement. Genius.
Oh, I mean, there's no question. Look, Weizmann was a very good scientist. He was not an Einstein. I mean, there's only one Einstein. Einstein was probably the best well-known Jew, maybe next to Louis Brandeis, in the world at that time. So Weizmann, but Einstein and Weizmann together were on the board of the Hebrew University. They always fought because of all kinds of reasons, which are not important to get into. But it's true. Look, he tried to get to Churchill during the war. This is your question. And Churchill, for the most part, would not see him. His aides used to say to Winston Churchill, by the way, he was the exact same age as Weizmann. They used to say to him, why won't you see him? Why don't you, I mean, you're here. So he said, well, I'm busy, I'm sick, I'm this, I'm that. He knew that he would have a hard time withstanding Weizmann's.
In fact, Churchill liked the Jews. He was a racist in many ways. He looked down on Indians and people of other dark skins. But for him, the Jews were in an odd way superior. What did Weizmann make of the Nazis and the Holocaust? This was not something he really could have imagined in the 1890s or even in the pre-First World War age. Did it surprise him?
When he read Mein Kampf, he knew that this madman, if he ever rose to power, would be very dangerous for the Jews. He was aware, of course, of Nazism. He was aware of all that was happening. Look, his power was very limited. What's interesting about Weizmann is that, again, a king without a kingdom. I mean, he was able to get entry into any president's office in Europe. By the way, he saw Mussolini 4 times. In fact, after the second time, Mussolini used to say, come visit me again. And Weizmann would or would not come. And Weizmann tried to persuade Mussolini, who was on friendly terms with Hitler, that the Zionists needed their own land to save the Jews, et cetera, et cetera. Of course, he was not successful. But he was aware of the danger. And he always felt that he and others did not do enough to save Jews. It's not clear what they could have done, but that feeling of guilt was in him. He was asked after the war to come to Nuremberg, to the trials and to present the Jewish case. And he said, I'm not worthy of playing that role. I did not do enough. Now, it's not clear again what he could do, because many of the people he tried to persuade to come to Palestine did not want to come. They thought that this was just a mirage. Hitler is going to calm down. The Western powers will do whatever they do. But obviously, most of them
and particularly, obviously, for the Jews outside Germany and Poland, Romania, Hungary. Was there, given his remarkable success as a chemist and his invention of this innovative breakthrough when it came to warfare, did I.G. Farben's connection with the death camps and the role of terrible chemicals in the destruction of European Jewry, did that resonate with him in a particularly sort of nightmarish way?
There's no indication that I could find that was the case. It may have gone through his head, but I really don't know. Look, what he tried to do during the war is what he always did. Weizmann was able to do something remarkable, which is he met every American president from Wilson on, with the exception of Hoover, who was
Wilson wasn't keen on the Jews either, was he?
No. But he saw him. He presented.
I bet FDR was more receptive.
Not really.
No,
not really. No. FDR had his own prejudices, prejudices about blacks, prejudices about other minorities, although his wife was very much involved with Jews, tried to help them, et cetera, et cetera. Look, it was Truman. The interesting thing is that Weizmann was able to gain entry into Truman's office, which took some doing, and Truman was fascinated by him, and Truman saw him as the potential president of the state of Israel, because he knew that Weizmann would not go to the Russian side. At that time there was a communist party in Palestine, so it was not a mirage to think that Palestine could not go to the Soviet bloc and support the Soviet bloc. But he knew Weizmann would not let that happen. And I believe, and I think we can prove it, is that that was resonating very well amongst the leadership in Palestine, and which in fact ended in making him the president.
We've got to get to the end of the story because I know you've got to run. It's a remarkable story, a biography. You noted earlier, Yehuda, that he died in a disappointed fashion in the last few years of his life. He wasn't happy. I think superficially one would have guessed the reverse. Israeli War of Independence, this absurd dream of an independent Jewish state in Palestine, was realized in 1948. Was he a man who, for all his remarkable achievements, did he become an anachronism in the Israel of the 1940s, in a post-Holocaust world?
The way to answer this is that, first of all, Weizmann, as I mentioned before, he had two large homes, one in Palestine, one in London. But he did not live in Israel. He did not live in Palestine. He spent more time there after he became president. But he was not happy with the state. First of all, he was not happy that he was not recognized for what he has done. Ben-Gurion paid him back because of all the insults that he received from Weizmann during his years in London and so on. And he was shunted to this home. He was very sick. He could hardly see. He walked poorly, et cetera, and so he spent as much time as he could, even while he was president, in Switzerland. He would go to Switzerland for long periods of time to recuperate, and to the United States also. So he was disappointed. He was disappointed in his own role, and he did not like some of the actions that Ben-Gurion took. Did not always approve of his actions, whether military or otherwise.
Well, any in particular when it came to the War of Independence and some of the supposed atrocities committed by Israeli military forces?
Weizmann was not a pacifist. He believed that if we need to defend ourselves, we will defend ourselves. There's no indication in his diaries or in his letters of any any deep thinking about the Palestinians and what happened during the war in Israel. So I can't really answer that question. He clearly was aware of what is happening, but it's not clear that this was something that occupied him. And he would have said probably that Israelis are allowed to defend themselves.
So finally, Yehuda, when we look back at this remarkable life, you're a great scholar. What can we learn from this man in terms of trying to figure out a peace in the Middle East, a peace that seems even more elusive now than it did in any period since the State of Israel, the establishment of the State of Israel in 1948? What can Weizmann teach us?
I think we can teach us, first of all, that he had a prophetic view that saw that Israel could not just exist on its own in that piece of land. That, in fact, these two nations needed to live next to each other in peace. And he truly believed that that was possible. He did his utmost, more than any other Arab leader. Look, In the final analysis, if you really want to look at history, even contemporary history, until 1967, the state of Israel was willing to come to some compromise with the Arabs, but this went nowhere. And in 2000, as you know, Ehud Barak, who was the prime minister of Israel, offered them practically 98% of the land, but it was rejected by Arafat. So I think that, what can we learn? We can learn that Weizmann was a person who believed that Jews have a right to that piece of land, to that heritage, going back to the Bible and earlier. And he also believed that Arabs had a place in that piece of land as well.
Well, it's the old narrative. It always seems to be that the quote-unquote Zionist narrative that the Arabs always turned down every offer they got, and there must have been a reason for it. And finally, Yehuda, is it conceivable that Weizmann and his fellow Zionists made a mistake, that they would have better off embracing socialism or internationalism, or even finding a place in the desert where there really weren't any people? Is it conceivable that in 200 or 300 years, Weizmann might be seen as a Faustian character in the narrative of the Jewish people?
I don't think so. Look, there was a proposal early on in the 20th century to send the Jews to Uganda. Just imagine what the fate would have been under an Idi Amin. I mean, and you can take any country you want. I mean, we can go through the whole.
Even Manchester, right?
Even Manchester. So no, I don't think so. I think that his view was that people need and should live in peace together. Now, you can say it was utopian. You could say that, but and he believed it even stronger after World War II. He bent Ben-Gurion's arm to accept the United Nations declaration. Look, Israel became what it is only because 5 Arab armies invaded Israel after '48, after the Declaration of Independence in May of 1948. But the land itself originally was a much smaller, and Jerusalem was always an international zone. He was willing to accept anything, but over time, it's clear he became disappointed with the Arabs. He could not understand why they could not agree to a peaceful solution. And I think that was a big disappointment in his life. And as I said before, he died not only because of that, but he died a very sad man. He lived, as I said before, probably 3 years beyond where he should have lived. At the height of his appointment to the presidency.